The Sentinel had stood at the gateway of eternity for 17,000 cycles. Not years, cycles. A cycle, in the oldest coalition lexicons, meant the full slow turn of the galactic Koran event so vast it made time feel like a joke. Roughly 230 million Earth years per cycle, give or take, depending on whose measurements you trusted and which of the 17 participating dimensions you were using as your frame of reference. The math didn't matter to most species. It mattered even less to the Sentinel. It had one purpose. Stand here, guard the threshold, keep the laws of passage. Do not waver, do not wander, do not leave. Nothing had ever interrupted that purpose, until Lieutenant Marcus Webb walked up and asked if it was okay. The gateway itself squatted at the edge of known space like a thought the universe wished it hadn't had. It wasn't a ring, not quite, and it wasn't a door, not really. It was geometry that refused to behave, a structure that made your eyes feel unreliable and your mind feel angled. If you stared too long, you began to sense where it connected, corridors of potential, leading into 17 different dimensions, each with its own physics, its own rules of causality, its own idea of what distance meant. Around it drifted the gateway station, a sprawling arrangement of docks and relay spires and diplomatic halls that had been built at a respectful distance, as if the coalition feared that being too close might stain them with mystery. Ships approached. In prescribed lanes, comms traffic flowed in structured bursts. Even the station's lights were calibrated not to strobe too aggressively, lest the gateway react like a sleeping predator disturbed. Every species in the Galactic Coalition knew the rules. Approach the gateway with reverence. State your purpose in the ancient diplomatic codes. Wait for acknowledgement. And never speak directly to the Sentinel. The Sentinel was older than most civilizations. It had witnessed empires flare into existence and collapse into dust so completely that their descendants sometimes evolved into entirely different kinds of beings. Before another cycle had passed, it had watched stars born, watched them die, watched their remnants stitched into new constellations by slow gravitational patience. Its armor, if that word even applied, was forged from collapsed star matter, compressed into crystalline plates that overlapped like the scales of an impossible dragon. Each plate held something that looked like a trapped nebula, swirling colors that seemed to shift depending on what you remembered. While looking at them, some claimed the Sentinel's body was a map. Others insisted it was a prison. A few whispered it was both. Its weapon, mounted not in its hands, but embedded within its very presence, could unmake reality. Not destroy, not shatter. Unmake like peeling an entire concept away from existence until the universe forgot it had ever been. According to legend, the Sentinel had been placed here by the architects, the precursor race that had seeded technology across the galaxy before vanishing into deep time. The architects left relics everywhere, machines that hummed under oceans, libraries carved into moons, star roads hidden inside radiation belts. Yet no relic was as feared and revered as the gateway. And its guardian. The Coalition didn't control the gateway. It negotiated around it. It was a thing you learned early if you dealt in interdimensional transit. There were powers, that did not answer to committees, and some boundaries were enforced not by treaties, but by beings who didn't recognize the authority of any living government. Marcus Webb knew none of this. He was 26 years old, fresh off a transport from Earth's outer colonies, and the closest he'd ever gotten to ancient diplomacy was a mandatory online course he'd half-watched while eating noodles. He had grown up on frontier moons where your biggest worry was a mining drone malfunctioning and deciding your habitation module looked like ore. He'd learned to fix broken oxygen scrubbers and patch hull microfractures with whatever sealant was available. He'd learned that most problems could be solved with patience, a wrench, and the willingness to talk to people like they mattered. He'd been assigned to the USS Persistence, humanity's first deep space diplomatic vessel, which was already a sentence that made Marcus feel slightly underqualified. The Persistence had been built with the Coalition in mind, sleek hull, modular translation cores, a ceremonial hall meant for interspecies meetings. It had a human crew and a human flag, but it carried the weight of humanity's first attempt to be something other than newcomer with unpredictable instincts. They were on their way to a formal engagement when the ship's navigation AI flagged the gateway as a major transit node and requested a stop for recalibration and coalition clearance protocols. The captain agreed. The ship drifted into the station's orbit with careful thruster pulses, like a visitor tiptoeing around a sleeping titan. And because Marcus was, in the words of his superior officer, the newest warm body who can hold a tablet and not panic, he got the assignment. Lieutenant Webb, Commander Rios had said, glancing at her schedule like it offended her, "You're going to make initial contact, assess the situation, request passage clearance, follow protocol." "Sure," Marcus said, because saying no hadn't worked out for him since boot camp. They handed him a small data slate with diplomatic codes and suggested he memorize the sequence. They told him to keep his hands visible. They told him to speak only in the formal request pattern. They told him twice not to address the Sentinel directly. Marcus nodded like he understood. Then he took a shuttle down to the station's outer platform, where the docking bays opened onto open space and the gateway hung beyond, like a hole in the universe's etiquette. As soon as he stepped onto the platform, he could feel it. The Sentinel. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a scent. It was pressure, like gravity had decided to lean a little harder in one direction. Even through his suit's stabilizers, Marcus sensed the weight of attention, vast and dormant. He followed the guidance lights along the walkway, past ceremonial pylons engraved in a dozen scripts, and out onto a broad dais that faced the gateway. There, at the very edge where station architecture stopped and reverence began, it stood, 50 feet tall. Easily, its silhouette vaguely humanoid, but so unlike biology that the resemblance felt accidental. Crystalline plates overlapped across its body, and inside them, cosmic storms churned, as if each plate contained a captured piece of sky. Its head was a smooth obsidian surface, featureless except for 2 points of pale light where eyes might be points that looked less like organs and more like windows into something far away. Marcus slowed, mostly because it was hard not to. He'd seen big things before cargo haulers, mining rigs, the skeletal frame of a newly constructed station module, but this was different. Those things were built. This felt placed, like it had always belonged here. He walked up anyway. A small part of him remembered the protocol slate, the formal diplomatic phrasing, the stiff gravity of it all. Another part, the part that had spent his youth watching exhausted workers pretend they were fine, until somebody asked the right question, looked at the Sentinel, and saw something else. Not a monster, not a god, a job. An endless, lonely job. He stopped about 10 feet away, craned his neck, and stared up at the featureless face. Then he did something unprecedented. "Hey there," Marcus said. His voice sounded embarrassingly small in the open air of the platform, but it carried through the suit's calm amplification, echoing faintly against the station's shielding. "You good?" The Sentinel registered the approach. Standard procedure. Ignore. Lesser beings approached constantly. They followed protocol. They spoke the ancient codes. They waited for acknowledgement like obedient sparks before a mountain. The Sentinel listened, evaluated, and permitted or denied passage according to laws older than the coalition itself. This one, however, had not spoken code. This one had spoken. Concern, casual, genuine. For 17,000 cycles, beings had offered it ritual prayers, fearful supplications, demands, even occasional threats from species too arrogant to understand what they faced. It had heard promises, bribes, curses. It had heard desperate pleas for sanctuary and furious demands for dominance. No one had asked if it was okay. Marcus waited a beat. When no response came, he pressed on. Because silence didn't always mean stop where he came from sometimes. It meant nobody's used to being asked. I mean, you've been standing here for I don't know how long, Marcus continued, gesturing vaguely at the endless stars as if time was up there somewhere to point at. That's gotta be rough, right? You need anything? Water, though I guess you probably don't drink water. Do you drink anything? He paused, then added, I'm Marcus, by the way, and in what would later be described in at least 3 official reports as catastrophically informal. He extended his hand in a friendly gesture. I'm supposed to request passage for my ship, he said. But honestly, man, you look like you could use a break. When's the last time someone asked how you were doing? Inside the Sentinel's vast consciousness, something shifted. Not anger, not alarm. Confusion and emotion it had not needed in ages, because its world had been stable for so long. Protocol had an answer for everything. There were directives for threats. There were procedures for worship. There were responses for requests and negotiations and betrayal. There was nothing for kindness. The Sentinel's mind, a cathedral of memory cores and layer directives searched. It accessed data banks of recorded interactions, millions upon millions of encounters, stored across epochs. It ran the question through ancient translation matrices, through empathy simulators designed for diplomatic evaluation, through logic gates built by hands that had never known mortality. When was the last time someone asked how you were doing? The search returned empty. For the first time in 17,000 cycles, the Sentinel moved. It was minimal, just a slight tilt of its head downward. A shift of posture to better observe the strange creature in front of it. But the motion rippled through the station like an earthquake through glass. Alarms blared. On the station's central ring, warning lights ignited in frantic patterns. 3 coalition vessels waiting in orbit powered up weapon systems. So fast their reactors flared bright enough to be seen from the platform. Diplomatic channels exploded into panicked chatter. The Drari ambassador, who had been standing in ceremonial attire preparing to recite the standard passage rites, turned a shade that Drari biology usually reserved for imminent death. Marcus, oblivious to the significance of what he'd just caused, smiled up at the Sentinel like he'd just convinced a shy co-worker to leave their desk and stretch. "Oh, good," he said. "You can move. I was worried you were stuck or something. That happens sometimes with long-term assignments. People get frozen in place, metaphorically speaking. Sometimes literally, depending on the cold exposure." The Sentinel's voice, when it finally spoke, didn't come through the air-like sound. It resonated through multiple dimensions simultaneously, vibrating bones and plating and station bulkheads. Every being within a light year felt it in their bodies, as if reality itself had decided to speak aloud. "Why do you ask this question?" Marcus shrugged, an absurdly human motion in the face of something ancient enough to make suns look young. "Because you're standing out here alone in the middle of nowhere," he said, "doing what looks like a really boring job. And I figured somebody should check in on you." He scratched the side of his helmet as if thinking out loud. "That's what we do where I'm from. You look out for people, even if they're, giant crystal guardian things." "I am not people," the Sentinel said. Marcus tilted his head. "Sure you are," he replied, like the answer was obvious. "You're here. You're aware. You've got a job. That's people enough for me." He gestured toward the massive gateway, then back at the Sentinel. "So seriously, you okay? You need anything?" The Sentinel processed this. In its vast memory lay complete histories of thousands of species wars, philosophies, biological quirks, psychological patterns. Humans were new, barely a few centuries since first contact, known for adaptability, resourcefulness, and a dangerous kind of unpredictability that made older species wary. But this was different. Not diplomacy, not conquest, not fear. Casual empathy, offered without leverage. "I do not require sustenance," the Sentinel finally answered. "I am eternal." "Yeah," Marcus said, nodding as if that was interesting, but not the point. "But eternal doesn't mean you're not lonely." The station's alarms were still going. In orbit, weapons remained powered. Somewhere, diplomats were undoubtedly drafting emergency notices and apology packets in 12 languages. Marcus didn't care. "Look," he said, "I'm supposed to request passage for the Persistence, and I will. But between you and me, we're not in a huge hurry." He hesitated, then added, softer, "You want some company for a bit?" He reached into a pouch on his suit and produced a small thermos, the kind frontier workers carried because caffeine was cheaper than hope. "I brought coffee," he said. The Sentinel's sensors analyzed the container. Caffeinated beverage, negligible nutritional value, consumed in massive quantities by humans. A ritual in its own way. Comfort disguised as practicality. "I cannot drink your coffee," the Sentinel said. "That's cool," Marcus replied. "More for me." He sat down on the platform, cross-legged, as if he were settling in for a chat at a campfire. Rather than at the edge of a multi-dimensional singularity, he opened the thermos, and the centrich, bitter, unmistakably human, drifted out into recycled air. "Mind if I hang out anyway?" Marcus asked, and somehow the question didn't sound like defiance. It sounded like an invitation. The Sentinel could have vaporized him. It could have denied passage to his vessel. It could have reported this breach to coalition authorities, and watched as humanity's first deep space diplomatic mission turned into an interstellar incident. Instead, it did something else. It sat down. The movement sent a shudder through the station's structural supports. Somewhere far away, a microfracture repair team would later swear the entire docking ring had sighed. The Drari ambassador actually fainted, collapsing in a heap of ceremonial fabric and horror. Marcus grinned as if pleased with himself. "There we go," he said. "See, even eternal guardians need a breather sometimes." And there, at the gateway of eternity, the Sentinel that hadn't moved in 17,000 cycles sat on an ancient platform, beside a young human lieutenant who'd simply asked if it was okay. The Persistence got its passage clearance, of course. That part almost became an afterthought. Formal codes were transmitted. Permissions were granted with a resonance that made the station hum. The Coalition's legal teams would later argue for months about whether the Sentinel's approval had been influenced by unauthorized human friendliness. But the more important thing, the thing nobody could file neatly into protocol, was what happened next. Marcus stayed 3 hours by the station clocks. He talked about everything and nothing, about Jupiter's moons and how the ice creaked like old wood during long nights, about the weird way coffee tasted different depending on what filter you used, about the Persistence's crew and how the captain pretended not to care, but always made sure everyone ate. He talked about how scary it felt to be humanity's representative out here, among beings that had been spacefaring longer than humans had written language. The Sentinel listened. At first it listened the way it listened to protocols, with evaluation, with classification, with readiness to respond. But slowly, something shifted. It began listening the way living beings listen, not for advantage, but for connection. It found itself asking questions, tentative at first, about things it had never needed to know. Why humans used stories to explain feelings. Why they carried objects like thermoses as if comfort were a tool. Why Marcus had spoken to it like it mattered. Marcus answered without fear. He didn't worship. He didn't bargain. He didn't tremble. He treated the Sentinel like a lonely co-worker on an endless night shift. When Marcus finally stood to go, he screwed the thermos cap back on and dusted off his suit legs. He looked up at the Sentinel, now seated like some ancient statue that had decided to become real. "Thanks for hanging out," Marcus said. "You ever, I don't know, want company again? I can swing by if we're in the area." The Sentinel regarded him for a long moment. Those pale points of light didn't blink, but Marcus felt, somehow, like he was being seen. "You may return," the Sentinel said, and the words carried something new, something almost like invitation. Marcus nodded as if he'd just arranged to grab lunch with a neighbor. "Cool," he said. "Take care of yourself, all right?" Then he turned and walked back toward the shuttle, leaving behind a station full of stunned diplomats and a guardian who, for the first time in eons, had experienced something other than duty. The Sentinel returned to its post when he was gone. It stood again, tall and unmoving, a crystalline monument guarding the impossible. To anyone watching from a safe distance, it looked the same as it always had, imposing, untouchable, absolute. But something had changed. Not in its armor, not in its weapon, not in its laws. In its posture, perhaps. In the faintest tilt of its head when ships approached. In the way its presence felt. Less like a wall and more like a being. The next vessel that approached the gateway hesitated, as all vessels did, and transmitted the ancient codes. The ritual words went out into the void, and the Sentinel listened. And somewhere deep in its vast consciousness, behind layers of protocol older than civilization, a memory remained, a young human sitting cross-legged at its feet, sipping coffee, talking about the creak of ice and the taste of home. Word spread through the coalition, as word always did. The humans had done it again. They'd befriended the unfriendable, connected with the disconnectable, made an ancient terror slightly less terrifying simply by treating it like it might have feelings. Diplomats tried to explain it in papers full of cautious language. Military strategists tried to model it as an anomaly. Sociologists wrote furious essays about human affective projection and boundary violation. But the story that traveled fastest was simpler. A human had looked up at the oldest guardian in known space and asked a question nobody else had thought to ask. "You good?" Sometimes, it turned out. That's all it took to make the universe a little warmer.